My name is Barbara Petrozelli. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs and very recently the Director of the Library here at the Mount. And I want to welcome you on behalf of my co-conspirators in iROC, Vivian Milzarski, who is currently our Interim Library Director, and also Evan Merkhofer from the Division of Natural Sciences. We're very happy that you've joined us here this afternoon. Let me say a little bit about what iROC is, for those of you who are not familiar. iROC stands for Investigating Research on Campus, and it's a forum, a bi-weekly forum, where we have a chance to learn about the work that our faculty are doing, their research, their presentations, their publications. On occasion, this will also include the work of our students as well as folks from the community. So it covers a very wide range of topics. And so we hope that we'll see you again at some future iROC presentation. Speaking of which, the next one will take place a week from today on Thursday, February 25th. That presentation will happen at 12:45 p.m. and will be given by Michael McGuire, who is an assistant professor of history here at the Mount. And he'll be talking about elective citizens, essentially, I guess you'd say the position that Radcliffe College took during World War I, and whether the question of whether they had shirked their moral responsibility in a global crisis. So I think that would be very interesting to hear about, and also possibly maybe a little relevant today. A few housekeeping things before we get started. We will hold all questions until the end, but if you have a question, please do put it in the chat. And when Professor Burmon finishes her presentation, we'll remind you of that question that you put into the chat, and you can ask it at that point. We are recording the session. However, you are not required to leave your camera on. So if you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to turn that off. That's no problem. What would be more of a problem is if you are not muted. So please do mute yourself. Take another second to look and make sure that you have done that. In terms of FYE, this program today has been approved for FYE credit. You don't have to do anything further in order to earn the credit other than to attend today. And what we'll do is we'll send the the attendance list to the FYE office, and your credit will be given that way. One other thing I wanted to mention is if you are here not as a member of the Mount community, but have heard about this program elsewhere, but you'd like to know about things that are being offered at the college, and you don't already get a bunch of emails from me telling you about different kinds of events, we'd be happy to include you in our notification list. So if you want to give us your name and your email address, also put that in the chat. We'd be happy to include you on future notifications about other things that we have going on. So that's it for me. Thank you again so much for being here. And I'm going to turn this over now to Evan Merkhofer to introduce today's speaker.
All right, great. Thank you, Barbara. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Burmon. She is an assistant professor of criminology in Division of Social Sciences here at the Mount. She received a master's degree from NYU in museum studies and a second master's degree in the history of art at Indiana University, where she specialized in Islamic art and architecture and ancient Greek and Roman art. She earned her doctorate from Northeastern University in Boston in criminology and justice policy. And her research focus is very much on art theft, which she's spoken about here before and is very interesting. And she's interested in examining variables significant to stolen art recovery. So she does take a very great quantitative approach to this. She's also looked at the historical impact of the theft caused by, or the result of archaeological looting and the destruction of fine art and cultural property. And her pedagogical interests are largely centered on community engagement and service learning in the criminology classroom, as some of the students here might know, and using projects to prepare students for positions in that field. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Burmon.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. So today I'm going to be focused on archaeology, annihilation, and anomie, consequences of looting and destruction of cultural property. So as Dr. Mercofer mentioned, my research does focus on stolen art recovery as well, but today I am taking a slightly different turn and sort of getting into considering the sort of art history and criminology and how these two disciplines merge, and a kind of corner of archaeological looting and the consequences of that that is less examined in the literature. So we're going to start with what is art. And that's about where we're going to end on that topic, because that's a dissertation in and of itself. So one of the things that is really difficult with art is, how do you define this? This is something that intellectually and sort of conceptually we understand, right? That if you ask somebody what their major is and they say art history, you have an idea of what that means. And yet when we try to come up with a precise definition to measure, in criminology, we like to measure types of crime. And so we need good definitions. Unfortunately, we don't get that in art. Art is so broad and everybody has different conceptualizations of it. But I want to highlight the institutional theory of art. And the definition under this theory is that a work of art in the classificatory sense is first an artifact. So you have to have some kind of object, and a set of the aspects of which has had conferred upon it the status of candidate for the appreciation by some person or persons acting on behalf of a certain social institution. In other words, the art world. So what this means is that art is not something that can just happen in a vacuum, that there is some sort of social construction to it, that we as a society define what art is. And we sometimes have very broad, when they say that some person or persons acting on behalf of a social institution, right? Our minds tend to go to the big, right? Oh, you have to have an art historian that claims that this is art in order for it to be considered art. You have to have a dealer or an artist or somebody involved in the art community. No, the reality is that if your 5-year-old paints something and you're like, oh, honey, this is wonderful, I'm going to hang it on the fridge, this is art, you're declaring it art. It might not be the art that is going to be hanging in museums and is going to be, commanding the height of prices in the art world, but it's art. And so this theory of art and so many others look at the definition of art through the art world and fundamentally how it's tied to social construction of a concept. That art is not something that just happens. We created this concept, and we define its boundaries. So the majority of theory and explanations of art is around its creation. And yet, what we don't talk about is its destruction. What happens when art is destroyed? So that's where I'm living today, is in that other side of things. So first, I want to define some relevant terms for this group. And we're going to start with archaeological looting. So this is probably a term that you might have heard in some context before, like Indiana Jones, who is a terrible archaeologist, by the way. So archaeological looting is any unscientific and illegal act of plundering archaeological sites for profit. So in a legitimate archaeological dig, what happens is that the archaeologist has to have permission, usually from the state. So, and that's by state, I mean country. So if I want to do a dig for Roman antiquities in Italy, I have to get permission from the Italian government. And there are a whole lot of permissions that usually go into that, agreements that anything that is found. So Italy and so many other countries have laws in place that anything that is unexcavated belongs to the country of Italy. So anything that you dig up, it's not yours. It's not the person even that owns that land, maybe. It is the possession of that country. And so there have to be all these agreements in place as to where those objects are going to be housed, how they're being recorded, and all of that. So when you have illicit digging, now we're getting into illegal acts. So when somebody finds an archaeological site and does not get permissions and digs however they want. So on the screen here, it looks like these are just holes in the ground. They are just holes in the ground, but they're holes in the ground at an archaeological site, which means that this is not how an excavation is typically done, right? You guys might have seen pictures where you have archaeologists with, very precise squares laid out, and they have strings. And basically when you're digging, and this is why Indiana Jones is terrible, is that you are going layer by layer through the earth, and you are recording where everything is being found. And you're being meticulous about removing objects and recording exactly where they were. Because if you find, human remains, well, it makes a really big difference to our understanding of that culture if those human remains are in a cemetery or in a kitchen, right? That's very different interpretation of those remains. So, cemetery, okay, we understand that. That kind of is in line with our own society. Kitchen, not so much. So we might have different hypotheses as to how and why that person ended up there. But when we have an illegal dig, all of that context is lost. So that's why it's illegal, part of the reason. It's destruction. When you have people just digging random holes, they're not using, underground surveillance work. They're not using, GSRs. They're not doing all the things that you might be able to avoid destroying cultural property, destroying the cultural sites. So it's not, even if they find an object when illegally excavating, the amount of history and the number of objects that they have destroyed to get that one piece is astronomical. So archaeological looting. So some of y'all may have heard in 2003, okay, for all the students, not so much you guys because you were like barely born yet, but the rest of us, in 2003, there was a really big deal made when the US invaded Baghdad, and there was a lot of looting from the Iraq National Museum, right? And that's the term that was used, was looting. Well, that's not archaeological looting, right? Those objects were already in a museum. This was not an illegal dig. There was archaeological looting that was going on at the time too, but that's when we talk about looting from the Iraq National Museum, a more accurate term is plunder, plundering during war. And this has been a tactic that has been used for centuries. One of the first written recordings of this occurring was in the Roman defeat of Syracuse in 212 BCE. And basically what happened was the Romans took these incredible statues and other works of art from the Syracusans and brought it back to Rome. And during their military parade of victory through the streets of Rome, they also paraded this art. And then that ended up becoming something that they did with regularity. But why they did it is because that was something that the Syracusans were very proud of. And it was a mark of defeat. It was a mark of conquest. It also, by the way, highly influenced Roman sculpture and such after that date. So post-Romans, you have the Ottoman Empire that did the same thing, that they plundered and took art from all kinds of cities and, Constantinople. And then you have Charles V of Spain, Napoleon, most famously probably as Hitler and the Nazis. We're still 7 decades later trying to return art that was illegally seized during the World War II. The time that the Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911, the excuse given was because the man who stole it was of Italian descent, and he believed that a work of Da Vinci should be in Italy because, and basically it was in protest of Napoleon having plundered most of Europe and Northern Africa to bring back the pieces that largely populate the Louvre. That particular man did not actually do his homework. The Mona Lisa is actually a very legitimate object that belongs in the Louvre because it was gifted by Da Vinci to the French king. So of all the pieces he could have chosen, that was one of the few that actually did not have that kind of history. But, and then most recently we have the Iraq National Museum. In all of these cases, art is a symbol. Art has been something that people have used, appropriated, destroyed, and created all in this cultural context. So it's important. So what is this impact of destruction? Art history is more than just the object, right? It is not, yes, we can go to a museum and we see this object. And that in and of itself, that connection with beauty or whatever else that work of art is eliciting as an emotional response, that is one way of connecting and experiencing art. However, a lot of times you'll see there are those little placards that are next to that object. Or you might go to a special exhibit, in which case a story is being told through these objects. All of that information is context. Why was this work of art created at the time it was by the person it was? And a lot of that is social commentary. And when we are dealing with ancient cultures, we don't have a lot more to go on than the objects themselves and where they're found. So when you have a work of art, it is key to determine the context, because that in part helps us understand its significance and its value. And so if you lose the context of that object, all that information pertaining to historical use is lost. And when that happens, we are losing elements of our shared human history and our understanding of where we came from, how we've developed, where we've been, right? When we find a cultural object and we know that it's of Greek origin, and yet we're finding it in a Peruvian grave, right? What? Now suddenly there's all these hypotheses about, international trade 2,000 years ago. I'm not saying that that's a real case. That's not. But there are we have found evidence of ancient trade routes based on where objects have been found. If we just have the object, we're going to assume that, oh, maybe it originated in Greece, when in fact it could have been in any number of locations that could have told us numerous things about the societies that used that object. And the other issue when you have archaeological looting is that it devastates the cultural site as a whole, right? You don't have looters coming in and saying, oh, I know that this super valuable work of art is buried 2 feet underneath where I'm standing now, and that they carefully ensure that nothing else around it is disturbed. No, they end up digging holes all over archaeological sites. And I can't remember if I have a photo in this slide presentation of it, but you can see from aerial perspectives of these sites, particularly in the Middle East right now, because they are conflict zones, where people have looted and the whole site just looks like gopher holes from the aerial perspective. And all of that, and they might not have found anything of value to them, right? Or only 1 or 2 objects. And they're destroying huge swaths of history in order to get those objects. So the next thing I want to talk about is how the destruction of art also impacts the art historical canon. So the canon is artwork regarded by influential individuals, not least connoisseurs, as being of the highest quality. In art history, the canon has usually, but not exclusively, been associated with the traditional values of art. In this way, the canon plays an important role in the institutionalization of art, as new works can be judged against it. As such, it is a means of imposing hierarchical relationships on groups of objects. This hierarchy usually favors the individual genius and the idea of the masterpiece. Moreover, the canon promotes the idea that certain cultural objects or styles of art have more value, both historical and monetary, than others. So there's a huge debate in, art history whether there should be a canon at all, and that's not what we're here to discuss. The reality is that if you pick up an art historical textbook, or usually there are a series of textbooks, they have to select certain items, right, that they're going to highlight, right? It's rare that you're going to pick up a textbook on Renaissance art and not see Raphael and so many of the great painters and sculptors, right? You're going to see Michelangelo. And so, but who determines what art gets in there? And at the very beginning of this, it says the highest quality, right? And however we may socially construct what that means. But there are these pieces in history, right, that even if you have no background in art whatsoever, you've probably heard of the Mona Lisa, right? That you've probably heard of the Sistine Chapel, that you've probably heard of some of these most famous works of art. And what happens if those get destroyed? What happens if we no longer have the Mona Lisa? Should we still study it? Is it still part of the canon? So the art historical canon helps us construct our understanding of art, and it influences the social construction of value, right? So the art market is a really wonky market, right? Usually when we're thinking about, okay, how much is something worth? At least part of that is going to be the expense that goes into it, right? And then you have a bit of a markup for creativity, ingenuity, etc. Well, art, it's a lot of markup, right? The cost of even someone like Van Gogh, who slathers paint on his canvases, right? The cost of his materials compared to what his art, goes for, That's a really big discrepancy. So it is how we attribute that value as a society is what makes these things worth what they are. And the art historical canon is influential in determining those prices. When you have archaeological looting, objects get damaged beyond recovery before they've ever been discovered. So we're not talking about knowing about the Mona Lisa and then it gets destroyed. We're talking about not realizing that the Mona Lisa ever existed, that it gets destroyed before anyone even knows and has the chance to see what it offers to the world. You also have a loss of context and potential understanding of its significance, right? So yeah, maybe that Greek urn that is, just so perfectly painted eventually gets recovered. And we know that it's illicit and we know that, it's been stolen and we don't have the records for it, but we have it, the object. But that's it. We don't know where it was found. We don't know who was responsible for making it, transporting it, putting it where it ended up, or why. Was this a grave object or was it something that was used every day? We have objects that get lost to the black market and ethically dodgy collectors. So the art market is what is considered a gray market. And so when you have, the issue is that the legitimate art market is relatively opaque. We literally just had laws, the bill that President Trump tried to veto, and then it was overruled in December, that included several new restrictions and regulations for the legitimate art market in the United States that will hopefully help with transparency. But until now, we haven't had that, and we'll have to see how effective those are. But basically, we still have a black market, and we have objects that have illegal paperwork attached to them that get sold on the legitimate market. And so every work of art comes with a history. It's called a provenance. And you can't sell a work of art without a provenance, at least not to any legitimate buyer. And that can be, the provenance is, if an artist sells you their work personally. So my mom painted this work of art behind me, right? With that comes, a statement. Usually you will get paperwork along with that sale, and you want to keep that receipt with the work of art, because then when you go to sell it, then you have a record that yes, it was this artist who painted this, this is when, this was the context. And that flows down the line every time it's sold, so that theoretically, what you're supposed to be able to do is trace any work of art back to its origin. Now, records over time have gotten lost, etc. But in order to sell in the legitimate art market today, you need at least a believable provenance. Problem is that you have people forging paperwork. And so, and for key collectors and, good dealers, they can usually spot dodgy paperwork. They can spot dodgy stories, right? There's, in 1973, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City acquired a massive Greek vase. And by that, I mean, this is huge. And it has been put back together. It was in pieces at one point. We know now that it was looted in 1972 from a site in Italy. And the Met, they knew. everybody knew. At the time, it sold for 5 times the amount that any other antiquity had been sold for at the time. But there was a history. And so the Met still claims, that they had no idea that this was stolen because this provenance for this work seemed legitimate. This provenance included the fact that this supposed vase that is probably 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep was in a shoebox in somebody's attic, unknown to the family for years. And when this person eventually passed away, the family found it. I think it would have had to be dust to fit in a shoebox. And even then, it would have been a tight fit. So, there are some ways that it's pretty easy to poke holes in stories. So things can end up on the black market or the legitimate art market with poor paperwork. And ethically dodgy collectors, dealers perpetuate this. Objects can also be destroyed, and usually this is ideologically motivated vandalism. So the cases of art vandalism that we've seen most recently, the Islamic State has destroyed numerous cultural sites and works of art. They have also, by the way, there has been evidence that they have also looted archaeological sites, sold those works to finance terrorism. But they've also destroyed certain sites. And a lot of that has to do with their ideology of eliminating other cultural idols and other cultural objects that would be considered valuable. And it has to do with the ethos of the group. So all of this means that there's a significant impact, right, in the destruction of these works of arts. But should we still study them? Right? There are so many objects that still exist. Should we be making room in the historical canon for other works? What about issues of authenticity? If you reproduce a work of art, right? We have some pretty high-tech images of the Mona Lisa. If that ever got destroyed, technology, we could probably reproduce it in a way that the vast majority of people would have no idea that Da Vinci did not paint that. Should we? And when you're talking about, reproduction, and then is the Mona Lisa as we know it still Da Vinci's Mona Lisa? Right. So it really raises a whole lot of issues in a number of different sectors of museums and art historians. So different disciplines may have different answers to these questions as well. And so, we're really looking at, can we still study destroyed works? And how far can we extend that study? And we have to look at how much that missing information is relevant. So in criminology, we do a lot of statistics work, right? And almost always in any survey, right, somebody doesn't answer one of the questions, right? Or they answer 5 when you wanted yes or no, and you're going, that doesn't work. So we have missing data. And we have all these statistical tests that up to a point, you can handle missing data. But then there's a tipping point. And now if you try to run that test without enough data points, it's not going to be useful. You're not going to get the information that you think you can get from running that test because you don't have enough of the fundamental data. And so it's kind of the same idea here. At where is that tipping point? How much knowledge did we need to know before a work was destroyed in order for that to be something that we can still study. And where does that fit in our history? All right. So this also, the destruction of art plays a role in museums and the museum world. So what is the purpose of museums? Well, usually it's considered twofold, and they go hand in hand with each other. One is public exposure to objects, right? The vast majority of us are not wealthy enough to purchase whatever art we would like to hang in our homes. So we collectively have agreed as a society that we're going to have these repositories for works that are culturally important for one reason or another, and we're going to allow people to come in. But going hand in hand with that is, yes, you guys can look at this work of art behind me and you can make judgments whether you like it or dislike it. Think about how you interpret it yourself. But museums have a secondary role, which is also education. And that's a huge component of the purpose of museums. It's part of the reason that they were founded and created, is not just to show off objects, but to teach people about them and the places that they're from and the context in which they were created, the societies and the cultures. That it's frequently art that is some of the first exposure to so many illustrations of our past. And, think about how many PowerPoints you sit through, right? How much more interesting are they with a visual component attached? If I just had black on white text for this entire presentation, a part of your brain would check out, no matter how interested you are in the topic, that we engage visually. And so, but museums are about connecting that visual engagement with the information and teaching people about any number of topics through objects. So given that, what happens when art is destroyed? And it's not necessarily just art, but it's the records. So when the Iraq National Museum was looted and plundered, it wasn't just that they had numerous objects taken and that they had numerous objects destroyed. Their records were destroyed. That the offices of that museum were gutted. That you had pieces of paper everywhere. You had computers smashed, right? And that was 2003. So yes, we had computer records, we had some digital records, but it was a process. Around that time, a lot of museums were working to get paper records scanned and put into databases. That, they weren't at the forefront of technology. They're still getting everything in the system. So we do have some information, but there was also stuff that was lost. Also, museums become repositories for archaeological site records, right? So it could be that an American who had been digging at a site in Iraq is not, the site still belongs to that country. And so copies of all of their information from those sites and maybe all of the final records for those objects, those are all housed in the museum. So again, there might be copies elsewhere, but when we are talking about the loss, it's massive. And not all of those local museums had the resources to be digital yet. And so if you have that loss of record plus the loss of the object, now you have almost no resources to recreate the existing documentation and the records. So museums also have a pretty significant opportunity to raise awareness of the impact of archaeological looting and other types of cultural property crime. So you'll sometimes see, more recently, they've done fakes and forgeries type exhibits where known forgeries have been put on display next to the authentic works of art and sort of ask people, can you spot the differences? Can you, where are the ethics in this? Why is it illegal to forge a work of art, but it's not illegal to fake a work of art? So they have these opportunities to reach a broader public who's clearly already interested in the art world if they're coming to a museum. But your average museum goer is not reading archaeological journals, right? They're not reading criminological journals. They're not reading academic journals of any kind. So how do you reach the majority of people to raise awareness of the fact that this is human history that we are losing? That this is actually something that we really all should be caring about because it's shared. And so with museums, and they're doing a pretty good job, better than the discipline of art history, if you ask me, at instituting institutional level changes and reconceptualizing the perception of their discipline, that it's not just about the creation of art. It's not just about the existing art. It's also about the destruction of art and how that impacts all of us. So you have, and this looting creates issues of ownership and recovery, because we have so many different countries have laws in place regarding what is unexcavated. So what has not been found yet, who does that belong to? Problem is, how do you prove that? Right? I've already talked about, ancient trade routes. So how can how can Italy say, no, that belongs to us? Right? If it had never been excavated, we didn't have those records. How do you prove that in a court of law? What happens if that object has since been sold and that anyone who had done their due diligence and their provenance research, it would have looked completely fine? That if this, we're seeing World War II restitution cases now, right? And some of these works of art have changed hands 5-6 times. And if those original records were good enough, so now somebody's purchasing in good faith, but what happens when someone claims that as having been originally stolen by the Nazis? How do you prove any of this in a court of law? What evidence needs to be required? And you also have the ethics of collecting. What are the duties and obligations of private collectors, museums, art dealers, everybody, auction houses, everyone working in the art market? Where do ethics come in, and how do we enforce those? So when we're talking about preventing archaeological looting, we have to take an interdisciplinary approach. It can't just be looking at it as archaeologists. You have the criminological approach, which offers explanations of who is committing these crimes. Why are they committing these crimes? Who isn't committing these crimes? Right? If we have terrorist groups in the Middle East, we have the behavior of the leaders versus the followers. Those are going to be different ideological and economical reasons. So global anomie theory posits that you have people who that you have countries with asymmetries, right? That something that is illegal in one country is legal in another, or you have a source country that has a high number of, say, archaeological objects, and you have a consumer nation where there's demand and not so many. So United States, we don't have a lot of rich archaeological heritage, with the exception of Native American art. And that is actually, we do have laws in place protecting Native American art, but we are in the largest sector in the art market in terms of consumerism. So those asymmetries create opportunities for crime. You have general strain theory, which talks about individual level pressures of stress and strain, and economic stress is one of the biggest, right? That if you're just trying to survive, especially in a conflict zone, you're probably not caring all that much about shared human history, quite frankly. And you're going to be more willing to loot those objects and sell them. So then you have sort of more local, primarily driven by those economic considerations. And so that general strain theory comes apart. You also have social learning theory, right? That we learn our behavior, and operant psychology, which talks about, rewards and punishments. If you loot and you sell the objects and you receive money and no punishment, what's to stop you from doing that again? So what's next? We need to engage in these issues more thoroughly, especially in the disciplines of art history and criminology. There are some of us that work on this, but we really need that interdisciplinary approach. And that's not right now, you see a lot of archaeologists writing about this, mostly because many of them were displaced from their cultural sites that they were excavating, and because of conflict. And so now, you had all of these Americans and British and Europeans working in the Middle East who can't get back to their sites and haven't in 2 decades. And so they've been raising awareness of, and yet we're still seeing these objects on the markets. But we need to, if we want to stop this, we need to look at it from more than just the archaeological side of things. We need to look at these issues more holistically. And we need to get better answers to questions with research and data collection. This can't just be theoretical, right? It's not armchair. And I realize I'm slightly hypocritical by giving a presentation that's entirely theoretical and talking about this, but we need data, we need evidence, we need a better understanding of the trafficking networks, that we need a better understanding of what is going on the ground and why people are engaging in looting behavior. And then we need to create not just domestic policies, but international evidence-based policies, practices, and programs. We need things in place that are policies that are built on reality and not outlier events that capture people's attention. And that's it. So, anyone have any questions?
There aren't any questions in the chat, Kate, so I would just open the floor up.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
How indicative is, it's a long question, the Museum of the Bible has been indicted, is a good word, for having an extensive collection of looted artifacts from the National Museum of Iraq. And how indicative is that of the international effort to restore artifacts to their origin countries?
There have been several museums that have been sort of targeted for having large portions of their collections that have been unethically acquired, shall we say. And there has been a lot of public push to return those items. And so you have cases, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that piece that I was talking about earlier from 1973, it took 20 years of the Italian government fighting, but they did eventually return it. You also have the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You have the Getty, all the Gettys, and Museum of the Bible. All of these places have unethically collected works of art. A lot of museums are cracking down on their policies. Museums are arguably among the least of the worst of the offenders here, because there are regulations in place and there are more opportunities for them to receive blowback in the discipline. So, you know, you have the American Alliance of Museums that will, you know, not allow membership and all of the benefits that membership will provide. You have sort of discipline level ostracization in a way. We're still, I mean, it's still getting there. There are still a lot of examples. There's also a wonky line between cases like the return of the Parthenon marbles to Greece, right? So the British Museum has been for years in contestation with the Greek government about the return of the marbles taken from the Parthenon. And a lot of what centers around that debate is legality. So there isn't really a legal leg to stand on, because there weren't certain laws in place at the time. There was, and so it's fuzzy, right? It happened in the 1800s. It's fuzzy. But in 1970, the UNESCO convention laid out a number of regulations. And now the issue with international law is that just because, you know, the United States signs a UN convention doesn't necessarily mean that we have to abide by it. We're just saying like, yeah, we like that idea. Like the International Criminal Court, we're totally on board with that. Oh, wait, you want us to ratify it? No. But we did ratify the 1970 UNESCO convention, or at least parts of it, which put a lot of regulations in place, and most countries did. That put a lot of regulations in place, the most significant being that if a work of art, so it has to be 1970, but basically pre-1970, if it doesn't have a history, there's not much we can do about it. Post 1970, if you do not have an ironclad provenance that is tracing where this work of art has come from, you're in trouble. And so that's helped a lot of museum collection practices. And that was part of, you know, that piece at the Met was one of the first that was caught in that net. But the problem is, how do you enforce this? Right? How do you prove that that was taken? So that becomes harder. But and that's part of why raising awareness among the public is so important, is because, you know, most people are not going to endorse this kind of behavior. And yet if people, and so they'll speak out about it, and there's power in numbers and power in our society condemning certain behavior. And so, but if we don't have that, if there are no consequences, if there are no social consequences, if there's no legal consequences, people are going to continue doing this. So it's really more about how do we ensure that there are consequences, and we're still working on that. So you'll still get museums that don't have the most ethical collections, but many are working to resolve that.
Anthony had a question, Kate.
Sure. Anthony?
Yeah, sorry, my internet's a little wonky.
Oh.
So I put in the chat. So you said earlier that governments take possession of these artifacts when they're dug up, and use like Italy as an example. So what would be the incentive for the people that are actually going out and doing the digging?
So which people? The archaeologists, the locals, the people that are doing it legally, or the people that are doing it illegally?
Legally.
Legally. I mean, that's the discipline of archaeology. Nobody, and like most archaeologists have not really been in it for the money and the glory, right? The again, Indiana Jones aside, that really what we're looking at is the history. It's how we learn about our past and how we learn about these societies is through legitimate legal digs. And so, you know, they've actually been doing a ton of work in Pompeii since the pandemic started, because now there aren't so many people going through. They've been able to excavate a lot more. They actually found, you know, a food stand, an outdoor food stand. And so, you know, that's why people do it, is the stories, right? It's the connection with, you know, past history. I mean, everybody also, it's part of a legitimate job, you know? So if I was an archaeologist instead of a criminologist, my summers, instead of, you know, doing research, well, I usually go to London, but it would be on an archaeology dig, which I've done. I also am a trained archaeologist. So I've done digs in Italy, I've done one in the United States. And so, yeah, you spend your summer, and that's what you're doing, is digging in the dirt and seeing what it has to offer, basically. But that in and of itself is really exciting. It's probably not exciting to a lot of people, but if you love archaeology, it is.
Samantha had a question, and that was all that came through the chat so far.
All right, Sam.
Hi, Dr. Burmon.
Hey.
So I was just wondering how the criminal justice systems in other countries kind of react to art theft and this kind of theft. Are there like harsher? Well, I don't really know. I guess my question is, where are there the weakest penalties and regulations in these kinds of thefts, and where are there the strongest regulations? Like, which countries take it the most seriously and which take it the least seriously?
Well, one way to measure that is how big is a country's art crime team. All right, so many countries do at this point have some kind of art crime team in their national police force. So the FBI has an art crime team. At any given time, they're usually between 11 and 13 people spread throughout the country. And usually what that is you have an FBI agent that's stationed in New York. And then if there is an art related case, they get assigned to that. However, there's only 13 of them, so it's not just New York. They're responsible for the entire Northeast, for example. But then you get countries like Italy, who have, at last count, 329 on their art crime team. They have a whole division, basically, for that. And so they take it extraordinarily seriously. And that's really what you get in terms of the difference. Is a lot of it has to do with certain cultural values. Not to say that we don't value art, it's just a different way of valuing it. We're a capitalist society. We also do not have a strong unifying background in a unified art history, right? Unlike Italy, where, you know, they have, you know, the Renaissance on, and then they also have, you know, ancient sites as well. But in terms of, you know, modern Italians and what they're, you know, able to relate to, they've had a pretty consistent society for a while, and they've had some pretty amazing art come out of that. And then add to that the historical background. So, you know, you have that situation. Iraq was a really bizarre situation because the borders of that country were drawn after World War I. So completely arbitrary. There's nothing connecting Iraqi society, right? They don't speak the same language across the country. They don't have the same religion. There's nothing, you know, they didn't fight for independence. Like there's nothing that's sort of shared. And one of the things that Saddam Hussein tried to do was go back to Mesopotamia and say, we share this. And he tried to bring back art as a mechanism of bringing people together, specifically focusing on that shared history of Mesopotamia. The problem was he was also Saddam Hussein and a horrible dictator. And so it all backfired. The concept wasn't problematic. It was the fact of who was executing said concept. And the problem is that people didn't view it as shared. They viewed it as Saddam Hussein, and they viewed it as the museums, they viewed as his personal repositories of art. And so that was part of the reason why there was so much destruction after he was taken down, was because it was a response to his pushes. And so this is where, so it kind of depends. Most countries, when it comes down to it, when you're talking about stolen art, possession of stolen art, when you're talking about criminal court, the most part, you're talking about property crimes. And they just don't carry the sentences that violent crimes do. And so you tend to see, you know, there was a case, a guy was smuggling hundreds of items from Peru into a dealership in San Francisco. He ended up getting 6 months. That's pretty standard. But that's, unfortunately, that's a story sort of across the world. Prison penalties don't tend to be very high just because of the type of crime. Now, that's part of the reason why there's more efforts going into trying to track how antiquities are being used to smuggle drugs, how antiquity sales are financing terrorist groups. Because if we can nail people for drug-related crimes or financing terrorism, now we've got teeth. But yeah, unfortunately right now there isn't a whole lot.
Okay, Kate, we're a few minutes after 5, but Robin had a question, so maybe the last question would.
All right, Robin.
Yes, I just wanted to know of the art that has been stolen from private individuals. Is there any data? Do you know how much of that has ever been actually returned to those private citizens or families?
I'm seeing your question in the chat. Are you specifically referring to the Holocaust?
Well, that's what I'm thinking about, but there may be other times in history when personal art was stolen.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty frequent to have works of art stolen. My dissertation data was looking at stolen art, and private collectors were the most common target, along with galleries. But basically, World War II restitution is sort of, it's an entirely different category because it was so systematic. The one benefit is that the Nazis kept meticulous records. And you also had private individuals keeping records. So there were some people who were in Hitler's hierarchy who were responsible for cataloging works of art and did not believe, and they were actually secretly working against him, but what they were doing was tracking where everything was going so that it would be easier after the war to reunite people. The biggest issue there, it would have been a lot easier process, but obviously so many people were killed. And then you had, you know, generations afterwards trying to rebuild lives in other countries. And, you know, it might not be until the grandkids had a chance to go back and look for that history and finding photos with, these works of art that are now in museums, but there have been a number of laws that have been put in place specifically regarding World War II restitution, as opposed to, a theft that occurs from a private individual. Otherwise, art is actually one of the only commodities where we see evidence that as the more time passes, the more likely your work of art is to be recovered. So, if you have jewelry stolen, there's a very low likelihood that's coming back. If you have a car stolen, you actually have a really high ability to get that back, but it's right away, right? If you're not getting it back, usually with property crimes, it's within a year or two. If you haven't gotten it back, you're probably not seeing it again. But with art, you see that, and then what we're seeing is a lull until about 25 years later. And what's happening is that people pass away, and then their heirs go to sell these works of art, and we find out that mom and dad weren't quite as on the up and up as we thought they were. So that's usually when we find it, is in when somebody that does not realize that it's a stolen work goes to sell it. So but that data is pretty preliminary. That needs a lot more to back it up, but that's what we're seeing so far.
Great. Thanks for that question, Robin. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Let me just remind you that if you are not a Mount student or employee and you'd like to hear about more of our iROC presentations, please leave your name and your email address in the chat and we'll add you to our notification list. And also remind you that our next iROC symposium will be next Thursday on the 25th at 12:45 p.m. So it'll be in the early afternoon. A talk by Michael McGuire from the history department on I guess you'd say the efforts of Radcliffe College to probably try to shirk their moral responsibilities during World War I. Really interesting topic. Very similar to how interesting Kate's topic was today. I mean, taking us into an area that maybe we don't spend all that much time thinking about, but when it's presented to us, we realize how rich it is and how much it gets us thinking about things that we may take for granted. So that was really interesting, Kate. Thank you so much.